The scariest thing I ever saw at work wasn't a person, it was a scatter plot. August 2022. I was on contract at a fintech startup in a converted warehouse off East 6th in Austin. The kind of place with a keg in the kitchen, a foosball table nobody used, and a founder who kept saying we were rewiring credit for the underbanked. We had about 40 employees. My job was to help finish the credit scoring model before Series B closed in October. I worked nights, not because anyone told me to, more because the office was quieter and the AC actually worked after 8 p.m. During the day, the second floor climbed to 82 degrees, no matter what the thermostat said. So I'd roll in around 7, grab whatever cold brew was left in the fridge, and sit at my desk until 3 or 4 a.m. Sometimes the cleaning guy would nod at me on his way out. Otherwise, it was just me and the hum of the servers in the closet across from my desk. The model wasn't mine. I inherited it from a guy who left in July, and my job was mostly to validate, document, and get it audit ready. Gradient boosting, about 90 input features, trained on a data set of roughly 2 million applicants. Standard stuff for what we were doing. On paper, it looked clean. None of the protected class features were in there. No race, no ethnicity, no zip code directly. The founder had put a slide about that in every pitch deck he'd ever made. The thing that first bothered me was a Tuesday, maybe the 9th of August. I was running a fairness diagnostic, just the boilerplate one the compliance guy asked for. You slice approvals by demographic group using the census-linked test set and check the ratios. Most groups hovered around a 78 to 82% approval rate for the pre-approved tier. One group came in at 61. 61 is not a number you can round away. I ran it again with a different seed, 61.4. Ran it on a different sample, 62. I sat there for a while just looking at it. The servers across the hall clicked over into their nightly backup, and the sound made me actually flinch, which tells you something about my state of mind. Now, the honest first thought was, okay, maybe the training data is skewed. That happens. You've got historical lending decisions baked into your labels, and the model learns to reproduce them. That's the boring version of this problem, and there are known ways to patch it, but we'd already done that. The guy before me had put in a reweighting layer specifically to correct for label bias in the training set. I checked. It was there. It was working. The training set disparity was under 2 points. The disparity was appearing at inference, on live-shaped data, which meant something in the 90 features was acting as a proxy. I pulled feature importances. The top 10 were what you'd expect. Debt to income, revolving utilization, oldest trade line, recent inquiries, employment tenure, all the usual, nothing screaming. I went down to 20, down to 30. Around rank 24, there was a feature I didn't recognize called something like device _ stability _ index. I opened the data dictionary. One line. Composite score derived from third-party device fingerprinting vendor. Third party. Great. I found the vendor contract in the shared drive. It was a small company out of Tel Aviv that sold a signal they marketed as identity coherence. The idea, as best I could piece it together from their white paper, was that they scored applicants on how consistent their digital footprint looked across device changes, IP hops, browser versions, network types. High score meant one steady laptop on one home Wi-Fi in the suburbs. Low score meant a lot of movement, phone-first usage, prepaid data, shared devices, public hotspots. I stared at that for a while. Then I did something stupid and pulled the join data. I wanted to see the correlation between device _ stability _ index and the census-linked demographic markers we only kept for auditing. The correlation coefficient with one specific ethnic group was around 0.31. Not enormous, but in a model with 90 features, it doesn't need to be enormous. It just needs to be a foothold. And when I ran the causal-ish stuff, permutation importance, and a rough SHAP dependence plot, that one feature was doing a huge amount of the work at the low end of the approval curve, the tail where the group in question actually lived. There was no ill intent in the code. I want to be clear about that. Nobody at our company had written a line that said, if applicant is X, deny. Nobody would. Half our team was from that group. The founder wasn't sitting in a back room laughing. It wasn't like that. It was worse than that in a way. Nobody in the building could point at the moment the bias entered the system. It arrived through a vendor, wrapped in a feature name that sounded like fraud prevention, and it was going to sign off on tens of thousands of decisions a month without anyone in the loop being able to say why. I stayed until almost 5 a.m. that night, watched the sky over the parking lot start to go from black to that gray Texas summer color where you already know it's going to be 100 degrees by noon. Drove home with the windows down because the AC in my car was busted, and thought about it all the way. I spent the next week building the case. I ran the model on synthetic applicants, where I held everything else constant and only varied device_stability_index. I did counterfactual pairs. I wrote it up like a paper. Executive summary, methodology, tables, figures, 16 pages. I did not use the word discrimination anywhere in the document because I wanted it to survive being forwarded. I called it disparate impact risk from a third-party feature, and I noted in the executive summary that this was, in my professional read, a regulatory exposure under ECOA and Reg B. I sent it to my manager on a Monday morning. He replied in about 40 minutes. "Thanks. This is really thorough. Let me loop in legal." Legal took a week to answer. The email came from a paralegal, not the general counsel. 2 sentences. "Received and under review. We appreciate you flagging this." That's the whole email. I saved it. 2 weeks after that, I asked my manager where things stood. He said legal was working through it and that the launch date hadn't moved. I asked if we could at least drop the one feature until they finished. He said that was a business decision. I asked whose decision it was. He looked at me for a second and said, "Look, if we pull it, our fraud numbers go up 8 to 12% on the projections. That kills the Series B story. You know how this works." I did know how it worked. That was the problem. The model went live on a Wednesday in mid-September. I know because I was in the room for the launch. The founder brought in donuts. Somebody clapped. I ate a donut and went back to my desk and pulled up the internal dashboard and watched the first hour of decisions come in. The disparity was still there. Of course it was. Nothing had changed. I went home at a reasonable hour that night for once, sat on my apartment balcony with a beer I didn't really want, and thought about all the applicants who would get told no over the next month, and the polite denial letter our system would generate for each of them, and the reason for denial it would cite, which would be something clean and legal like insufficient credit history or high inquiry volume. Not a word about a device fingerprint score they'd never heard of, from a vendor they'd never heard of, that had quietly decided they weren't consistent enough to be trusted with money. I filed the CFPB complaint the next weekend from a coffee shop on South Congress, on a laptop I'd bought used off Craigslist and only used for that. I didn't put my name on it. I attached a redacted version of my report and the correlation numbers. I did not mention the company by legal name, but I gave enough that a competent investigator could find it in about 10 minutes. I don't know if anything ever came of it. I never heard back. That's not how the CFPB works, at least not with anonymous submissions. I put in my notice 2 months later, in November. I said I had a family thing. My manager took me to lunch on my last day and told me I'd done good work, and that he hoped I'd come back someday when the timing was better. He actually seemed to mean it. I think he was mostly a decent guy who had a mortgage and 2 kids in private school and a boss he was scared of. Most of them are. The startup is still around. I looked them up last month. They closed the Series B and then a Series C. There's a puff piece about the founder in a magazine you'd recognize. It calls the company one of the most promising inclusive lending platforms in the country. The word inclusive is right there in the headline. The vendor is still around too. Their signal is now integrated into a bunch of other lenders. I know because I recognize the feature name when I see job postings from those companies. Same 3 words, same vendor, showing up all over the industry. Sometimes people ask me what the scariest thing I ever saw at work was, and I never tell them this one, because it doesn't sound like a story. Just a number on a screen, and 40 people in an open plan office who all individually made a reasonable choice, and a system that will keep making decisions long after any of us is around to remember why. I still don't know how many people got a no that month because of a signal they never even knew was being measured. I probably never will. The last appointment on my Thursday sheet in March was a routine prenatal check. First trimester, new patient. She walked in with a man in his late 60s, and he was the one who held the door for her, but not the way a family member holds a door. He held it so she had to pass under his arm. I work at a clinic on the west side of Detroit, a few blocks off Grand River. State-funded, sliding scale, the kind of place where half the patients pay in cash and the other half don't pay at all. Most of my day is blood pressure counseling and Medicaid paperwork. I've been there almost 8 years. You learn to read a room fast. He introduced himself before she did. "I'm her uncle," he said. "She's a little shy. English is not her first. You know how it is." He smiled at me like we were sharing something. She sat down in the chair by the wall, not the chair next to the desk. Her coat was still on. She kept her hands in her lap and looked at a spot on the floor between my shoes. I said hello to her directly. I said her name, the one on the intake form. She didn't lift her head. He answered, "She's good. She's tired." The bus was late. "Ma'am," I said, still to her, "can you tell me a little about how you've been feeling?" He answered again, "Nausea in the mornings. She eats crackers. I bought her the ginger ones from Kroger. I've had husbands sit in on visits before. Boyfriends, mothers, sisters, best friends. Sometimes the whole family shows up for the first ultrasound and you have to shoo 2 ants out of the room so you can get the wand on the belly. That is normal." What was not normal was the way he sat forward on the edge of his chair, closer to me than to her, angled so his body was between hers and the door. He was heavy-set, wearing a canvas work jacket that smelled faintly of cigarettes and something under that I couldn't place. Motor oil, maybe. His hands were on his knees, clean nails, a wedding band on the wrong hand. I asked how far along she thought she was. He answered, "About 10 weeks." I asked when her last period was. He answered, "Around New Year's," he thought. I asked if she had any medical history I should know about. He said no, she was healthy, no allergies, no medications. I looked at her. She did not confirm or deny anything. She had not spoken a word since she walked in. "Sir," I said, "I'm going to need to do a physical exam now. We'll need you to step out to the waiting room. The nurse can show you where the coffee is." He didn't move. "She gets nervous," he said. "She wants me here, right?" He didn't turn his head to look at her when he said it. He just kept looking at me. She nodded once at the floor. That was the moment. Not a jump, not a chill, just a small, clean click in my head, like when you realize you left the stove on. I have been doing this long enough to know what a shy patient looks like. A shy patient makes eye contact and then looks away, laughs at her own quiet answers, relaxes when her person is in the room. Her shoulders were not relaxed. Her shoulders were up under her ears. I let a beat pass. I smiled at him the way I smile at drug reps. "Of course," I said. "Let me just have her change into a gown and we'll get started." I handed her the paper gown and pointed to the little half curtain in the corner of the exam room. She stood up slowly, keeping her back to him. When she took off her coat and reached to fold it over the chair, her sleeves rode up, her wrists, not one bruise. A pattern. 4 small ovals on the top of one wrist and a single larger one underneath, the kind of mark a hand leaves. On the other wrist, the same, older, going yellow at the edges. Her fingernails were bitten so far down that 2 of them had scabbed. The index finger was split at the cuticle and had been split more than once. I did not react. I turned to my computer and clicked on a tab I wasn't reading. Behind me, he was talking again. About the weather. About how the potholes on Livernois were getting worse. About how she was a good girl. Quiet. Easy. Not like these American girls today. He talked the way some people talk in elevators, filling every second so no one else can slip a word in. I realized I had been in the room with him for 7 minutes, and I had not heard her voice once. She got up on the table. I did the blood pressure cuff, listened to her heart, palpated her abdomen. Standard. She flinched when I put my hand on her stomach, then held very still, like she'd corrected herself for flinching. He was 2 feet away in the chair, watching. I said, in the calmest voice I own, "I'm going to grab the Doppler from the other room." "Give me 1 second. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. Our head nurse that day was a woman I'd worked with since I started at the clinic. We'd done deliveries together, and we'd done the paperwork after a stillbirth at 2 in the morning together. I caught her by the med cart. I kept my voice at the volume you'd use to ask about a lunch order. "The man in room 3. I need him out of that room for 30 seconds. Tell him there's a problem with her insurance card. Photocopy it twice. Ask him about her address. Anything." She looked at my face for about half a second. She said, "Got it," and walked past me toward the room without breaking stride. I heard her through the door, warm and apologetic, all Michigan vowels. "Sir, so sorry. The front desk needs you for just a minute. The copy didn't take. You know how it is." A pause. Him starting to protest. Her, cheerful and immovable. "It'll be 30 seconds. I promise. Right this way." The door opened and closed. His boots went down the hall. I went back in with the Doppler in one hand and a prescription pad in the other. She was still on the table, looking at the door he'd walked out of. I did not say a word. I clicked my pen. On the top sheet of the pad I wrote, in block letters, "You are safe here. Nod if you need help. I can get you out today." I turned the pad around and held it up in front of her face. She read it. Her eyes moved across the words twice, then a third time. She looked at me, actually looked at me, for the first time since she'd walked in the building. Her eyes were very tired. There was a small cut on her lower lip that I hadn't been able to see from the desk. She nodded. One nod, small. I tore the sheet off, folded it into quarters, and put it in the pocket of my white coat. "Okay," I said, out loud in a normal voice in case he could hear from the hallway. "Let's listen for that heartbeat." I ran the Doppler over her belly and we both listened to the fast, wet gallop of a 10-week fetus for about 40 seconds. Her face did not change. I told her, out loud, that everything sounded strong. Then I stepped out again. I told the nurse to keep him at the front desk. I did not say why. She did not ask. I went to the small office at the end of the hall, where our clinic social worker sat 2 days a week. And by a piece of luck, I'll take credit for the rest of my life. That day was one of them. I closed the door behind me, and I told her, quietly and in order, what I had seen. The wrists, the nails, the cut lip, the way she had not spoken, the way he had answered every question about her body as if it were his to answer, the wedding band on the wrong hand, my gut for what it was worth. She was on the phone before I finished. What happened next was not dramatic. That is the thing I want people to understand about this. There was no shouting and no scene in the waiting room. We have a protocol for this. It exists because we need it to exist. The social worker went into the exam room. The nurse kept the man at the front, then moved him to a small side office to finish some forms for the pregnancy Medicaid application. He sat there for almost 40 minutes. He was polite. He asked twice, then 3 times, where she was. He was told, each time, that she was finishing up with the doctor, that these first appointments run long, that there was coffee if he wanted it. By the time he understood something was wrong, she was already in a car on the way to a shelter with an address I do not know and will never ask about. I do not know her real relationship to him. I do not know if uncle was a lie or a technicality, or a family word doing work no family word should have to do. I know what her wrists looked like, and I know she nodded. The last thing that happened, before the front desk staff walked him back out onto Grand River and locked the door behind him, is that he asked for me by name. He wanted, he said, to thank the doctor for taking such good care of his niece. I did not go up front. I stayed in the back with the door closed, and I finished my charting for the day, and my hands were steady, which surprised me a little. She had an appointment on the schedule for 2 weeks later. She did not come. I never expected her to. Every so often I open the drawer in my desk where I keep the pens I don't use, and the folded square of paper is still in there, because I never threw it out, and I am not going to. I've had one afternoon out hunting alone that didn't fit anything I'd seen in 20 years of doing this. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything you'd call supernatural. It was a plate of hot food set out for me on a rock, 10 feet from my tent, and nobody around to have put it there. This was early November of 2022. The elk had been quiet all season, and by that point, I'd already burned through most of my vacation days chasing the herd across 2 different units. I wanted one more trip before deer rifle opened up, so I picked a spot in the Clearwater country I'd hunted maybe 3 times before, up past a Forest Service road that turns to washboard about the 2nd mile in. I went alone. My brother-in-law was supposed to come, but his kid got sick the Tuesday before, and honestly, I didn't push him. There's something about a solo camp that scratches an itch you can't get to with company around. You hear more, you slow down. I made the trailhead by early afternoon on a Thursday. The sky was that flat white you get in the panhandle when snow is thinking about coming, but hasn't committed yet. I hiked in about 1.5 miles to a bench above a creek I remembered from a scouting trip in September, dropped the pack, and set up camp before the light got low. One tent, the small 4-season one my wife gave me for Christmas the year our second was born, bear bag hung 100 yards downwind, twig stove under the vestibule. My kit was tight. I've been doing this since I was 12. That first evening was uneventful in a good way. I saw a fresh sign coming down to the creek and a scrape on a young pine that made me feel like I'd picked right. I ate a bag of freeze-dried chili out of my mug, that same beat-up steel mug with my initials scratched into the bottom, the one my dad had given me at some point in the 90s. I turned in early. Wind picked up around midnight, and I woke twice to it hammering the fly, but that was it. No footsteps, no voices, no lights. Nothing to write home about. I was up before shooting light on Friday, made coffee, drank it out of the same mug, rinsed it and stashed it in the small mesh pocket sewn into the tent wall by my head, left camp around 6. Hunted a saddle to the north for most of the morning, saw a cow and a spike but nothing legal, and by early afternoon I was working my way back south along a game trail that I knew would spit me out about 200 yards above my tent. I wasn't in any hurry. I'd stopped to glass twice, once at a little clearing where I ate a granola bar and drank from my Nalgene. The wind had settled. I remember the woods being very quiet in the way they get right before real cold moves in. I came down to camp from the ridge side, quiet, boots soft on frozen duff. I could see the orange of the fly through the timber before I saw the clearing itself, and then I saw the smoke. Not much. A thin white line off the ground about 10 feet from my tent, curling up and then flattening out under the canopy. I stopped where I was. There was no reason for smoke to be at my camp. I hadn't left a fire. I hadn't even had a fire the night before. I'd been running the twig stove for coffee, and that was under the vestibule and long cold. I stood there for probably a full minute, just watching, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Then I brought the binos up. On the ground next to my tent, on a flat rock I'd been using as a bench, sat a small cast iron pot. Next to it, an enamel plate. Steam was coming off both. And next to the plate, right where I might have set it myself if I were tired and hungry, was my mug. My mug. I'd left my mug inside the tent, zipped in. I lowered the binos and stood there and listened. There was wind moving through the tops of the trees, and a raven somewhere off to the east, and nothing else. Whoever had done this was either gone or waiting. I did the only thing I could think of. I slid my rifle off my shoulder, chambered around, and stayed put. I watched the camp for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. I picked apart every dark shape in the timber. Nothing moved that wasn't wind. My hands got cold inside my gloves, and I could hear my own breath. The steam off the pot never fully stopped the whole time I stood there. Whoever set it down hadn't been gone long. Eventually, I worked my way down into camp, wide, coming at it from an angle where I could keep the tent between me and most of the tree line. The food was real. That's the part that got me. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't dressed up trash. There was a piece of what looked like backstrap in the pot, cooked in some kind of broth with wild onion, and on the plate was a cut of the same meat with a couple of small potatoes. A spoon rested across the pot, not one of mine, wooden and old, worn smooth on the handle in a way that told me somebody had used it for decades. I did not touch the food. I unzipped the tent slow. Sleeping bag, pad, extra base layer, headlamp, the paperback I'd been failing to read at night, all exactly as I'd left them. Nothing moved, nothing gone through. The mesh pocket where I'd put the mug that morning was empty. That was the only thing missing from inside, and the mug was outside, next to a plate of hot food, on my rock. I sat on my heels in the door of the tent and tried to think. Nothing about this fit anything I understood. A bear would have wrecked the place. A person looking to steal from you doesn't leave food. A person looking to poison you doesn't leave the pot behind, because the pot goes back with them. It was like somebody had walked up, cooked me a meal, set my own mug down like a place setting, and left. I stepped back out and put my back against a big fir and just looked. My eyes went out into the trees on the downhill side, because that's where the game trails ran. And after maybe half a minute of scanning, I found him. A man in the timber, about 100 yards out. Older, wool coat the color of the bark behind him, which is why I hadn't seen him on the first pass. He was standing still with both hands at his sides. He wasn't hiding. When he saw me see him, he didn't move. I raised a hand. He raised one back. I don't know why I walked out to meet him instead of shouldering my rifle and telling him to stop where he was. Something about the way he stood. He had a rifle slung across his back, an old lever action from what I could see, muzzle down, no urgency in any of it. I closed the distance slow. He waited. Up close, he was maybe 75, weathered in the way men get when they've spent more nights outside than in. Gray beard, cropped short, small eyes, kind. He nodded at me when I got within talking range. "That your camp?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Yeah." He nodded again, like he'd expected the answer and was satisfied by it. "Saw the tent yesterday afternoon coming through the draw," he said. "Thought I'd come back around and put a plate on for you." I didn't know what to say to that. He must have seen it on my face because he added, calm, "I've been walking these hills going on 40 years. Camp of my own about 2 miles east, up under the rimrock. When I come across a man out on his own, I feed him if I've got it. Old way of doing. My father did it. His father before him." "You went in my tent," I said. I tried to keep it flat. "Took the cup," he said. And he wasn't apologizing, he was explaining. "To pour the broth. Man ought to eat out of his own cup if he has one. Put it back where I set the plate. Figured you'd forgive me that much." I stood there and looked at him. The wind moved his coat. "You didn't want to just wait," I said. "Didn't want to spook you," he said. "Man comes back to his camp and finds a stranger sitting in it. That's a bad thing. Man comes back and finds a meal. At least he gets to decide." He watched me a second longer and then said, "Go on and eat. It's getting cold. I'll come sit if you want the company. I'll walk on if you don't." I wanted him to leave. I also, somehow, didn't. I told him he could stay. We walked back to the tent together, and I sat down on the rock. The broth was still hot when I got the first spoon of it up. Salt, wild onion, a fat richness I never cook into anything at home. I ate the whole plate. The elk was his, taken a week before with the lever gun on a north-facing slope he'd been hunting since Reagan was in office. The onions were from a patch he knew along the creek. He'd carried the pot and the plate in a canvas bag on his back and cooked it on a small fire he'd already knocked down and covered by the time I came in, which is why I hadn't seen anything but the last of the smoke. We talked until the light went out of the trees. He told me about winters up here in the 70s. A partner of his had died on a mountain in Montana in '89, and he talked about that for a while. Not in detail. He said the elk had moved differently since the fires. He asked about my kids. I told him. He asked what I did for work, and I told him that too. He didn't offer his name, and I didn't ask. It didn't feel like the kind of conversation where you traded names. When it got full dark, he stood up, thanked me for the company, took his pot and his plate and his old wooden spoon, and walked off into the timber the way he'd come. I heard him for maybe 30 seconds, and then I didn't. I hunted 3 more days out of that camp and never saw him again. I've been back to that bench twice since. The rock is still there. He isn't.